So the British Prime Minister hitting Russia with a fresh round of sanctions from the UK 3 years after the invasion of Ukraine. So what will they actually mean in practice? Ben Chu from BBC Verify has more.
Foreign Secretary David Lammy is announcing a new package of sanctions on Russia. And they include sanctions on firms importing machine tools to Russia that can also be used by its military, and some new sanctions on North Korean generals who've been involved in sending troops into Ukraine. The European Union has also announced its own new sanctions today, and they include a clampdown on a so-called shadow fleet, which has been used to illicitly sell Russian oil to the West, and new export restrictions on video game controllers used to pilot Russian drones on the battlefield. But let's take a step back and look at what sanctions were already in place. In January, there were more than 2,000 individuals and companies subject to UK sanctions in relation to the Russian invasion. Around 2,300 were subject to EU sanctions, and the US had also sanctioned more than 5,800. That all makes Russia the world's most sanctioned state. But how effective have these sanctions been, and will the new ones make much difference? It's important to recognise that there are two purposes for the sanctions. One, to put pressure on Putin and individuals in the regime which are close to him. Second, to impede Russia's ability to wage war in Ukraine, and also to damage the wider Russian economy. Now, on the first front, there has clearly been an impact on the ability of Russian oligarchs identified by the UK government and the EU as close to Putin, like Roman Abramovich, to travel to Western capitals. And many of their assets in the West, such as houses, have been frozen. As for the wider Russian economy, the reality is that it's weathered the unprecedented barrage of Western sanctions in 2022 better than initially expected. This dotted red line shows what the International Monetary Fund forecast would happen to Russian economic growth in April 2022, just after the initial sanctions were announced. The forecast suggested the country would slump into a deep recession. But this dark blue line shows what actually happened. It avoided that slump and was forecast to keep growing. That's partly because Russia's been able to continue to source consumer goods and some vital industrial components from China. And it's worth noting that the Western sanctions were never intended to be complete when it came to Russian energy. They wanted to reduce the revenues flowing to the Kremlin for its oil through a price cap, but not to cut off those flows completely, because Western leaders were worried about the impact of that on prices in their own countries. However, some analysts say there are signs that the Russian economy is now coming under severe strain, and that it's best encapsulated by this, which shows the interest rates set by the Russian central bank. Russia has had to devote a considerable share of its national economic resources to producing weapons and paying soldiers. That's created some serious domestic inflationary pressures. That's why the central bank has had to put interest rates up to 21%. Some economists doubt that this is sustainable for Russia. Nevertheless, it's hard to be certain how much of this economic pressure on Russia is specifically due to Western sanctions, and how much to the general strain of Putin's shift of the Russian economy onto a war footing.